Welcome to this very short seminar or interview with Professor James Robinson from Harvard University, who's together with Daron Acemoglu is the author of the Worldwide Success, Why Nations Fail. I heard, James, that it sold over 200,000 copies only in English.
Yeah, that's true. But I won't sell that many. I think the Mongolian translation will sell fewer.
And it's already translated into
Portuguese, Spanish, Korean, Chinese, Turkish, Finnish, and there's a lot more coming.
So why do you think there's such an interest for a book with a title, Why Nations Fail? Doesn't country want to succeed?
I think that's right, but the book's also about success as well as failure. I mean, so if you could explain failure, then to us it's a sort of the two sides of the same coin. So
why did you choose the title, Why Nations Fail?
Well, I think that's because most of our academic work has been about failure. We've always thought it was more puzzling, the fact that countries fail to do sort of obvious things that would promote economic development. So that's been a lot of the focus of our academic research. And I suppose we've always been sort of obsessed with that topic, trying to understand what mechanisms lead to
So we have all these lists of what to do in order to succeed. And your message, in a sense, well, why don't people just do it? But they can't.
Yeah, but it's the politics that gets in the way. That's the problem. So the economics is sort of understood, but politics is not necessarily consistent with good economics. So we emphasize that what you need to be successful is to have what we call inclusive economic institutions, sets of economic institutions that allow broad-based incentives and opportunities in society, but politics often gets in the way of creating such a set of economic institutions.
So inclusive economic institution depends on inclusive political institutions.
Right.
Could you give examples of these two kinds of institutions that benefit success, I guess? Yeah.
In terms of economic institutions, one of the institutions, so for example, we talk about in the book would be, what's key for economic success is kind of innovation, new ideas about new technologies, new ways of organizing production, increasing productivity. So one of the examples we look at is the patenting system in the 19th century in the US. There's a lot of work on the social origins of patentees, kind of inventors, Thomas Edison, people like that, Eli Whitney. And we emphasize how the patent system itself was a very inclusive economic institution in the sense that it was the same rules for everyone, it was open to everyone, there weren't elites who could kind
open up for poor and rich
and
rural people. And
and it was a system that it was an institution that allowed the US to harness all of this talent and skills and ideas and energy which were sort of spread out in society.
Basically, that's a question of property rights, the rule of law, stable rules, and so on, for the markets to work.
Yeah, the rule of law is absolutely crucial. The idea that you have rules, universalistic rules that apply to everybody. There's no deals, there's no insider deals, there's no discrimination, but we kind of emphasize that, where does that system come from? Where does the rule of law come from? That comes from sort of politics. To have something like the rule of law, you need to have the political circumstances in place. That's why, the Chinese government now might be saying, oh, we're going to have the rule of law, but we'd say you can't have the rule of law in the dictatorship of the Communist Party. It just doesn't work like that. You're bound to have.
So within your system, you go from politics to markets and not the other way, really.
I think, yes. I think logically one could think about that reverse feedback, but a lot of our academic research has sort of made us skeptical about this feedback from economic growth to, or markets to politics. So, yeah.
In this book, you have hundreds of examples from all over the world, and you just mentioned China, but it's about Latin America, Africa, and so on. Mm-hmm. You don't say that much about stable democracies in Scandinavia or Northern America, and so on. So if we have a society with inclusive political institutions, fairly inclusive economic institutions, are there examples in history where people move from such a system into what you call extractive
Yeah.
institutions?
Well, certainly there are, and I think that we emphasize this dichotomy between inclusive and extractive, and we emphasize that once societies get set up in a sort of inclusive way,
Yeah.
then there's feedback loops that tend to perpetuate inclusive institutions. But there's certainly always threats. Even in an inclusive society, some people are always going to be able to benefit by creating an extractive society, and they'll try to do it. So we look at some historical examples of that. The one we use most saliently is the example of Venice.
Yeah.
Venice had, by the standards of medieval Europe, very inclusive economic and political institutions, but it all went into reverse, and the place went from being the most dynamic capitalist economy of the medieval Europe into being a kind of backwater, where people just provide services for tourists, and everyone admires, all the great things they did 600, 700, 800 years ago, rather than a dynamic entrepreneurial place. So that's an example where everything did go into reverse, and I think it's even true in the United States or Sweden, or in Sweden you could say
What
that.
could trigger such a process in a?
Well, I think you could imagine that any system could be captured by some subset of people, some subset of elites that have essentially a kind of extractive strategy. You could say one interpretation of what went on in Sweden, I guess, was that this kind of socialist extractive program, this what was it called? The Meissner Plan, was it?
Yeah, the wage earners funds and
Right.
everything.
So that this was leading to a society that a lot of people were very scared of, and that led to a reaction in society against that. We would say this is a positive feedback, a kind of virtuous circle, that Swedish was an inclusive society, but there's different projects to move it away from that. They could be right-wing projects, it could be left-wing projects, and you could say the same thing about England. I was never very much a fan of Mrs. Thatcher, but many people would say Mrs. Thatcher similarly. People voted for Mrs. Thatcher because they were very worried about the type of economic and political, particularly economic strategy that appeared in England in the 1960s and 1970s. So that system, the system righted itself. These feedback mechanisms kept it on an inclusive path. So I think, yes, there's always threats to any kind of inclusive institutions, and there's always pressures.
We should all
by
look
different
out for
groups.
extractive institutions and special interests and other
Yeah,
actors
yes.
who try to make benefits on others.
I think
yes.
that's right. I think any society, even a society as functional and inclusive as Sweden, there's always potential threats. Institutions are kept going by the actions of individuals to kind of support them. And, once you're in an inclusive set of institutions, there's many things that lead that to perpetuate itself, but there's also, things that can make it go off the rails. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I would recommend all of you to read the book. I think it's a great read, and thank you very much
Yeah.
for coming here.
Although, unfortunately, there's very little about Scandinavia.
Well, there are implications in it. Thank you very much.
Okay.